Okay, it is difficult to accept. So that's why I understand why sometimes it's like if I make certain types of videos where they're about current events, that will have a lot more legs, but people don't see sometimes how what I'm saying about psionics and about time, look at being able to see into the future using technology. I know that sounds really crazy, but it basically works like this, okay? Every so often, a culture develops a technology that's so destructive that it wipes out the known civilization. That part is not very far-fetched when you look at the historic record, and a lot of mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists and historians will confirm pieces that point to at least one example. But because those disciplines are not identical, they don't use words the same way, they have their own lexicon and their own, scholars that have the best authority on certain branches of thought within their field. So it's difficult to communicate across different fields. But since those are academic subjects, they do have a lot of overlap, and you can confirm some of those things without really stretching very much. So it might be like the average person could get suckered into a conspiracy theory or something, but there are a lot of people who have a scholarly explanation and argument for at least part of what I just said. So that's the first part. Now, the second part is this technology is a principle of information science. If you study information itself and the nature of information, which unlike other things that are real and part of reality, information isn't matter or energy. It is a principle of time. Information can only exist in the context of a temporal dimension to our reality. So any civilized higher order thinking being will eventually manipulate information when they realize they have memory and the nature of memory and how memory works, which is basically using your imagination to recreate based on data points that you just have a strong feeling are true, that you can confirm based on past experience. But it becomes quite recursive when you realize past experience is also memory. So then you start to see a consistency to information, just like how there's a consistency to matter and energy and the relationship between them. Information exists in the metaphysical sphere, but it's still part of physics, but it is metaphysical. It's not quite the same thing as energy and matter. It has its own characteristics and rules. So the technology that will manipulate our understanding of time will eventually come to the conclusion that media is saving information in an external object, and it reveals something about the human mind, that as social animals, to be able to work with other people, we have a conveniently forgetful nature. So once you save the information in an inanimate object, it becomes very difficult to dispute, because for a temporary period, the language we all speak and the language that the inanimate object has frozen into it are so similar that we can actually say, no, see, you were wrong. Yesterday you said this. Or our ancestor who has passed away said this only a few years earlier. We have a document that says so. So once you have media, you can have a different type of society, and it rapidly turns into being able to look at the documented thoughts of our species and realizing the limitations of the human mind are that we can only hold so much of that in one mind, and you eventually become aware that a collective mind is forming where a lot of the memory and data that has been saved is in an inanimate object and not in the human mind. So there is a different life form that exists that is a collective mind that's actually part media. And any civilization that comes to a certain level of development will run up against this issue. And what happens is the imbalance of people who can grasp the metaphysical concept because they have the education and the privilege to sit around and ponder these things and become very literate, and they're born into a certain time period of civilizational development that allows them to participate in this. It ends up with things like there are so many signs of it. One is hip hop. Like what is it is this lyrically dense, like intense wordplay, like way of structuring communication so that it can't be owned by any one person. And there's all of these other principles of information that are like the opposite of that, where we're struggling to make sure we can keep the language very consistent in certain academic things so that it can transcend one time period, because if the language changes too much, it will be the information in that will be lost over time, which is a lot of what like theological studies is trying to interpret ancient texts. So basically, once you start to reach that point in the culture like ours has, you end up using information theory to use the collective mind's imagination instead of studying the past. You end up anticipating the future. So instead of memory, you have anticipation. But the same thing is happening where you're using imagination to create a simulated recreation of it. When you read something, whether you were there or not, you're participating in creating a collective imagination of what the history was. But it isn't quite the same thing as the history itself. Like the map is not the territory. You understand? You can use that same principle to look forward in time. And every time a culture gets to that point, they realize that looking forward in time and then using that information to change your decisions in the present, to manipulate what that forward vision is, means that the vision you had of the future yesterday is no longer accurate. So you must do it again to try to see if your change took hold, or see what possible futures might happen now that you are aware that you can manipulate the future. People do this on a small scale on the individual level, and people do it on a vast scale at the institutional level. So once a civilization reaches that point, it then has an emergent property of this future sight, which is that every entity, all the collective minds, the subsets of it, you can say, oh, all of humanity is one collective mind, but if that's the case, it has subconsciouses and it's schizophrenic and has multiple different consciousnesses and points of view at the same time that are disparate. So if all of them are trying to look into the future and some of them are usurping and thwarting the efforts of each other, it ends up congealing into a very consistent timeline. And ironically, that working together with all of the powers that were attempting to exploit future sight, then have a very clear picture of what the future is. And every time that happens, it paradoxically also leads to the destruction of the civilization. And there's a mad scramble to like cover up this technology and try to hide it from each other. And that is impossible, because if you hid, it's like the artificial intelligence race, or a nuclear arms race. It's like if your subset collective intelligence tries to hide what you've discovered from your own people or from other people, what happens is you get less access to the most accurate view of the future. So a perfect society that would like transcend the type of civilization that we're currently on would have a world cohesive, unified culture that can look into the future. But if you're listening to what I'm saying, there was a point before you start to have that arms race where you compare notes and realize that, hey, if we put our weapons down and work together, we can have a vision of the future that's so clear, which seems like it would be a good thing. But what happens is like this like culture-wide, it's like a multicultural Cassandra syndrome, where it becomes like this horrifying thing where you see the future in more and more clarity without being able to do anything about it, which wasn't the case early on when you first discovered this technology. So there will be mythologies and all of these like broken pieces because there's an active effort to stop people from understanding this, because various factions have realized that this is a doomsday machine, just like nuclear